welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be about children's spirituality. Specifically, what is spirituality in early childhood education? I'm very excited about this video because children's spirituality has been a topic that I've been passionate about and have been researching since 2005. I have published many book chapters and articles and even a book that stems from a research study that I conducted with children in New York. And I'm very excited to share that with you today. This video is going to be geared toward teachers and teacher candidates and those who train or prepare teachers, such as teacher educators. But anybody that's interested in the topic of children's spirituality is welcome to watch, and I'm sure you're going to find something that you can learn from this video. In the video, I am going to share some definitions of spirituality, the difference between spirituality and religion, which is sometimes a topic that provokes some controversy. I'm also going to share what has been studied in the literature regarding children's spirituality and the different views on it that can be found in the literature. And I am also going to share with you some theories that have stemmed from research and research studies that have been conducted in the past, including mine. I will also share the findings from the study that I conducted, and then some ways in which we can nourish and support children's spirituality in the classroom. I would love to hear what your opinion on this topic is, so if you want to leave comments, please do so. I'm always interested in people's opinions on this topic because, as I said, it's a topic that I hold near and dear, and I'm always collecting data on people's opinions on if it's a topic that should be further explored and how it should be nourished with children in the classroom. So without further ado, let's get into it. I hope you enjoy it. In this video, we're going to focus on the meaning of spirituality, specifically on its meaning for early childhood education and early childhood educators. I am Dr. Jennifer Mata. Welcome. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to think about is, how do you define spirituality? How do you understand it? What does it mean to you? And take a little pause, if you want, pause this video for a little bit and think about this, jot some notes down. You're then going to share this in the discussion board later on. But I want you to start thinking about it so that when we start talking about definitions about spirituality, you have something to ground them and to base them under within your own understanding and definition of it. So if we look at the literature, some of the definitions that are out there can be grouped in different categories. Some authors claim that being religious is not indispensable for being spiritual. So spirituality and religiosity are two separate constructs for these authors. Others claim it to be a human characteristic. So they define spirituality as a universal human phenomenon found in cultures and in every age group. And they again say it's not specific to any religious group. And then still another group of scholars define spirituality as unifying with something other. So they talk about a sense of being connected beyond oneself, and they talk about being connected with something greater. And that something greater could be defined and denominated in different ways, but still could be under a religious lens or without having to focus on a religious lens. Still other scholars look at the definition of spirituality as a combination of things, and some of them look at it as a combination of otherness and humanness. So they say that spirituality is a relationship between the self and a higher power that is dynamic, interpretive, relational, integral, and part of the human life. So it's part of a component of who we are as humans, but it also allows us to make those connections with the higher power. Still others define it as essence and consciousness. So they define it as the spiritual is seen in terms of being active, energetic, vibrant, vigorous, vital. So it's about sort of being alive and having that feeling or that sensation of being alive. So we look at some of the definitions, sort of the summarize, or the summary of the definitions. We have Palmer's definition of spirit as the ancient and abiding human quest for connectedness with something larger and more trustworthy than our egos, with our own soul, with one another, with the world's history and nature, with the invisible wines of the spirit, and with the mystery of being alive. So that's spirit. Spirituality, as I defined it after a compilation of definitions that I reviewed, is an innate human characteristic that allows us to connect with the transcendent or the divine or the divinity and feel part of the universe. This connection can originate in a human trait, but it goes beyond the individual. So it's part of who we are as human beings, but it can go beyond that to tap into the essence of life and provides humans with a greater consciousness and understanding of being. It also, in later publications that I've done, I also extend it to encompass the search for purpose and meaning in life as well. Another definition that is important to highlight is spiritual experiences, and Lantieri defines the spiritual experiences as the conscious recognition of a connection that goes beyond our minds and beyond our emotions. Other authors also talk about spiritual experiences, but they call it transcendent experiences. And Grove defined this as the feeling that one's consciousness has expanded ego boundaries and gone beyond limitations of space and time. So the spiritual experience or the transcendent experience is about the emotions and the sensations that occur as a consequence of that connection with that something greater or beyond ourselves. I'm going to show you an image of that encompasses all these different definitions of spirituality, right? So we have those who think that spirituality is defined as human nature, those who think that spirituality is defined as unifying with other or something other, grander than oneself, and those that see it as a combination of otherness and humanness. But we also have some scholars that define it as essence and consciousness, and we also have other authors and scholars, researchers that define it as a direct sensory awareness experience. But I want us to look at two definitions that sometimes are used indistinctively, and some authors make a case to differentiate them. In my work, I term spirituality as different than religion or religiosity, and so when I present my work, I usually present these two definitions side by side so that it's easily, the differences between them is easily identifiable. So religion, and this comes directly from the dictionary, is a set of beliefs and practices held by a human community involving adherence to codified beliefs and rituals. Right? So it's a group of people that come together, they share beliefs, they share practices, they share rituals, and they adhere to a code. They adhere to certain dogma that guides their practices. Spirituality, on the other hand, I understand it, and through the research of the literature, I've understand it as an innate human potential that can be understood as a direct sensory experience, by some authors who define it that way, and which allows people to connect with a transcendent or higher power beyond our minds, our emotions, beyond our ego, beyond ourselves, in order to feel part of that something greater. That goes beyond ourselves. It also relates to the search for meaning and purpose in life. And it's not necessarily, it can be very individual. It doesn't need to be lived in a community or a group. It doesn't need to be shared in terms of others believing the same set of beliefs as the person does. It could be a very individually based experience. Whereas religion, the practice of religion or religiosity, is a very communal kind of experience where groups of people come together and share their beliefs and their practices. Going back to the literature, the different views of spirituality fall into two different areas that are contradictory in a sense, or opposing. So whomever you're reading, depending on whom you're reading, you'll see that spirituality is either understood as a developmental area, which is a compartmentalized view of spirituality, because if we see it as developmental, then the child, for example, would have cognitive development occurring in him or her, language development, physical development, and social and emotional development, and spiritual development. So it would be another category to add to all these different categories of development. Other scholars view it as through a holistic lens. So they view it as the wholeness and who we are as human beings. And I fall under the category of scholars that view it, have a more holistic approach to spirituality, because there's this duality in the way that that scholarships look at this. So the literature, when you're reviewing the literature, it's sort of divided into these two camps, or these two groups. So how does spirituality fit with what we know and use? Because you can say, well, how do we know if something falls under spirituality, even if we look at it developmentally or if we look at it from a holistic perspective? And it's not social emotional development, or it's not moral development, or it's not emotional intelligence, or it's not other things. And the way I view and understand spirituality is as an overarching sort of umbrella, a term that encompasses everything else. And that's why it's up here, sort of above everything else. And from that, we find character ed and virtues and values. We find moral development and all the theory and all the studies that have done in the area of moral development. Then we find ethics of care with Nell Noddings and the work that she's done there. And then we find social emotional development and all the things that we know about how children best develop socially and emotionally. We have works on emotional intelligence, differentiating emotional intelligence from rational cognitive intelligence, so differentiating IQ from, or the intellectual coefficient from EQ, or the emotional coefficient. Then we also have social intelligence that has also been studied and proposed as another way of measuring these aspects of children. And we even have a group of scholars that have looked into spiritual intelligence and how you measure and determine that, which is this like section right here. I don't believe that spirituality as we've defined it can be measured, and is because I don't view it as developmental, I don't see it as something that you can get better at, or that you can progressively go through stages until you reach the highest or the most developed stage of spirituality. In fact, there have been studies that have been done in other cultures where the people in the culture believe that children are more developmentally developed than adults, because they're closest, since they were born recently, or at least more recent than an adult, they're closer to the spiritual realm. They come from the spiritual realm, or they've been in this material realm far less time than adults have. So in their view, in their eyes, children are much more spiritual than adults. But from a developmentalist perspective, a developmentalist wouldn't believe that, because children sort of are born sort of at the bottom of the developmental ladder, and they climb up that ladder as time and experiences and nature and nurture take place in the child, and the child can achieve more advanced levels of development in each of the areas. So there's that contrasting view that takes us back to this opposing understanding of spirituality as development, or as a holistic understanding of it as just part of who we are as human beings. So let's move on to the classroom, because we define spirituality, we see how it sort of fits into the literature. We see how different scholars have approached it from different perspectives and angles. And then now let's look at how can it be incorporated in the classroom if it can, right? So we in the US have something that we call the separation of church and state, right? Which means that aspects of church and aspects of state are separated, it should not be mixed or come together. But what people often don't know about the separation of church and state is that, and I'm going to read this quote. It says that we should remember that not only do the courts forbid any action by government schools not prompted by a secular primary purpose, or which would principally in primary aid religion. So primary aiding religion, promoting religion, proselytizing a particular religious belief is prohibited, right? It's prohibited by the government, and anything that has to be, that is secular or state related. So public schools that are federally funded, that are funded by the government, would not necessarily be the places in which we want to proselytize or we want to aid or we want to promote religion. Yet, and this is the part that's interesting, that people usually forget, is this section here that is in purple. They also forbid any that would inhibit it. So if you do anything also, not to proselytize, but to inhibit any religious belief, and they're talking about religion here, not spirituality, any religious belief, that is also forbidden. That is also a no-no. So you can't promote it and proselytize and try to convince children in schools that one religion is better than the other, or that this is the religion that we all have to abide by, but you can't negate that the religion exists and that the children have a right to explore it and experience it and talk about it and just bring it up to the table if they so desire. If you inhibit that, you're going against what church and state is, the separation of church and state is telling teachers to do. Kessler says that the curriculum should integrate heart, spirit, and community with strong academics. So both of these things should be there into what we plan for children and what we have them invest time in. She proposes, this is Rachel Kessler, she proposes that teachers need to welcome the soul into the classroom through a climate of respect and time for solitary reflection and to ponder questions of meaning and purpose. So it's not about creating a lesson plan for spirituality, and it's not about creating designing activities for it. It's more about creating the spaces in which children can reflect, children can think about these things, and an overall climate of respect in the classroom. Other authors have other propositions. Ron Miller, for example, says that the quality of the relationships in schools are key, and that spirituality could be nurtured through those relationships and those rituals that we have daily in school. Palmer talks about providing teachers the opportunities to reflect, and in helping teachers reflect on their spirituality and think about what spirituality means to them, they can then decide if they want to invite that into the children or for the children that they work with. Suhurst talks about all teachers, regardless of what or who they teach, can identify appropriate spiritual experiences and consider them in the curriculum. So they can provide these sort of classroom conditions in the instructional portion of their teaching that can help children evoke spiritual or transcendent experiences. Lentieri also says that spiritual experiences cannot be taught, so it's again not a matter of designing a lesson plan or creating an activity or an experience for them, but it can be uncovered, evoked, found, and recovered. So it's about opening those spaces for that to happen. So let's look at authors or scholars that have studied children's spirituality or have studied spirituality, and how do we tap into spirituality? How do we promote? What is it exactly that we're looking for when we're talking about spirituality, and in particular children's spirituality? So Tobin Hart studied children. He did a retrospective research project with adults, and he asked them questions about when they were children, or asked them questions about their children, and the adults' recollection of their experiences or of the experiences of their children that their children were having, and they were part of that experience, is what he gathered as data. And he identified 5 spiritual components: wisdom, wonder, connections, wondering big questions, and the invisible, that were characteristics of children's spirituality. So there were incidents where children demonstrated great wisdom, saying things that were not typical of a, say, 4-year-old or 5-year-old. They were very wise and very appropriate for whatever the experience was in the moment. So it was very in tune with what was happening. Then wonder was another spiritual component. It was about being in awe, being sort of in wonder of things that were around them. So being sort of taken aback or by a situation and being sort of speechless. And that was sort of the wonder component. Another was connections, and it had to do with relationships and connections with others, and how children sort of thrived through deep, nourishing connections, and those were considered spiritual components of children's spirituality. Wondering big questions was another way. Questions that children ask about: why are we here? What happens after we die? Does God exist? Why are we born? Are we born many times afterwards? And those kinds of questions that children wonder, that have to do with the spiritual realm, were another component of children's spirituality. And then the invisible was the 5th component, and it had to do with experiences that children had with aspects of the world that we don't really see. For example, a child had related that an angel or some entity that looked like an angel had caught them as he fell out of a 2nd-story window. And the adults didn't really know what had happened, but the truth of the matter was the child fell off the 2nd-story window and was completely unharmed, not even a scratch on his body. And when they asked the child what had happened, he said, well, the man with the white dress and the white wings and the light caught me and put me on the ground. So those kinds of stories that children recount and share with adults that have to do with aspects of the material realm that are not material, that are invisible, that are not visible to the adults. And Hart's book is called The Secret Spiritual Life of Children, and he, through his interviews with adults, he came to understand that children quickly come to understand that the spirituality, especially the invisible portion, this invisible component, is not something that they should be sharing openly with adults, and it's something that they keep secret to themselves. And that's why he entitled his book that way. David Elkins also studied spirituality, but he studied adolescence, and he discovered these 8 paths through which people, adolescents and adults, could tap into their spirituality. And in my work, I found that some of these were true for some of the children that I worked with as well. So he said that the feminine, the arts, the body, nature, psychology, mythology, relationships, and dark nights of the soul were the 8 different paths that he had found that could potentially help a person, an adult or an adolescent, to tap into their spirituality. So moments in nature where enjoying a sunset or enjoying the sceneries, you're just taken aback and felt like you were living a spiritual moment, or in the presence of art or an art piece that you're so mesmerized by the beauty of it that that constitutes or may constitute a spiritual moment. And what he said was that people had preferences for these paths. And some had exclusive preference for a particular path, and some had a combination of paths that worked for them. So maybe relationships was one, but also the body and exercising and pushing your body to the extreme was another way that someone could tap into their spirituality or their spiritual sense. Other authors that have studied spirituality are Hay and Nye, and these are authors from the UK. Whereas Tobin Hart and David Elkins are from the US. And Hay and Nye did study with children, and they discovered through their interviewing of children and conversations with children and looking at children's drawings and productions that had to do with spiritual prompts that they had been given, they discovered categories of spiritual sensitivity. And I'm not going to go in depth here because you can see the slides and you can read them, but they talked about awareness sensing that consisted of being attentive or paying attention or completely present. Then they talked about mystery sensing that had to do with the experiences in life that were initially incomprehensible. So wonder, awe, imagination fell into that sensing category. And then value sensing was the third sensing category that they found, and they determined that was using feelings as a measure of what we value. So feeling before cognition. So being guided, our actions and our behavior being guided by emotion or being guided by the moral sense. So or things that children value. So these three areas of sensing were ways in which children expressed and lived their spirituality. In this next slide, I've combined those three theoretical frameworks into this conceptual framework that has the three of them combined. So we have Hay and Nye's awareness sensing, mystery sensing, value sensing, and all the ramifications that come under each of those. And then how those ramifications can relate to either one of Elkin's paths, or two of them, or one of Hart's spiritual components. So ultimate goodness, for example, is one of the value sensing components, would relate to Hart's connections, and would also relate to Elkin's relationship. So here you see sort of the connections between what the different theories propose. In my work with children, I did a phenomenological study with 4 kindergartners, and I went into the classroom and observed them for a few months, and I was looking at 3 specific research questions, and the findings that I obtained had to do to help me respond to these research questions. So my first research question was, what constitutes a spiritual experience for a child? What is it, in a sense? And what I found was that a spiritual experience for a child, or specifically for the 4 children that I observed, is any experience through which the child can express their joy, their compassion and kindness, their sense of relating to other, and or their creative and imaginative self. So this is what I found in the children, and any experience through which they could express this would be a spiritual experience. These experiences that I observed could be outwardly or inwardly triggered, so something could be happening outside that would trigger this experience, or something could be happening inside that could trigger this experience. And sometimes can provoke pondering and searching through inner thought and conversations, although mainly they manifested themselves, these spiritual experiences manifested themselves ordinarily in everyday activity. So it wasn't about living spirituality secretly, like Hart had mentioned, and it wasn't about hiding it from others, and it also wasn't about this production that had to be made for a spiritual experience to occur or to be able to be observed. It was more of a day-to-day kind of experience that happened in day-to-day interactions with their peers, with their teachers, with other adults in the classroom. The second research question that I was looking at was how are spiritual experiences lived and expressed by children? So what I found was that spirituality manifested itself in everyday experiences and interactions, as I said before. And this is a quote from my book, and I'll read it for you. "The children I observed did not need permission from teachers to ponder, to ask questions, to be kind, to care for others, to connect to their surroundings, to enjoy favorite activities, to be helpful, and to be concerned. They just were. They expressed these spiritual aspects freely and without a carefully designed spiritual curriculum behind every activity and action they engaged in." So it was a very natural kind of expression and a very spontaneous kind of expression of spirituality, and the experiences that they lived daily on a daily basis were just normal, regular experiences that every child lives in a kindergarten classroom. It's just that they chose to express themselves spiritually through those experiences. So the third question that I was looking at is what seems to prompt or evoke spiritual experiences for children in the classroom. So I could determine that children express spirituality through joy, through concern for others, through relationships, and through imagination. But what prompted that joy, that concern for others, those relationships, and that imagination to be expressed? For joy, I observed personal accomplishments, so getting it right, praises that were given by teachers or adults or by their peers, a sense of pride. All of these would be triggers for joy. I have here a quote: "Other triggers for joy as a spiritual experience were being assigned a task, a seat, or an activity which was very much liked by the child. Music and movement activities were also very much triggers of joy. Free play with favorite friends, books, and materials also triggered joy. Witnessing something funny or a surprise encounter and peers demonstrating kindness towards them also triggered joy." So all of these interactions with others also were joy triggers for the children. Concern for others was triggered through witnessing others in need. So every time a child would witness others in need, they would volunteer to help, or they demonstrated concern for others, even if it was in a facial expression and no action behind that concern. But there was a demonstration, a visible, observable demonstration of concern for others. And then relationships was observed or was triggered through family values that the children had, and imagination was triggered through play, role-playing, sharing stories, images that was shown to the children, and books. And then they would retell these very creative, imaginative kinds of stories. So we're going to wrap this up, and I wanted to leave you with this sort of question: how can you nourish spirituality in the classroom? How do you think that you could nourish spirituality? So what do you think it is? Do you think it's important enough to nurture in the classroom? And then how would you do it? And I've asked students in the past this question in several occasions, and these are some of the answers that I've received. So through meditation, activities of meditation, teaching the children to meditate in the classroom, through quiet times to reflect and have them write or think about self-reflections, journal writing, and giving children prompts to just write about their spiritual experiences, how they feel about it, and why is it important for them or not. Having discussions, large group discussions with peers, or small group discussions with those who are interested in the topic. And then through activities that promote diversity, that promote social justice, through unit designs that have big idea questions that tackle these social justice kinds of issues. And then having a discussion box where children write down their feelings or their problems or topics that they want to talk about and put in the discussion box, and have that be a source of discussion prompts or discussion topics for the whole group. So now that we've finished the presentation, I will encourage you to go to the discussion board and complete your thoughts on spirituality and how you would use it in your early childhood classroom with the students or the children that you work with. Thank you. Thank you for viewing. I hope you found it educational and learned something about children's spirituality and how to implement it in early childhood education. Come back for weekly videos and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye.